Today's reading comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14 and verses 22 to 33. A very familiar story that's told in Matthew, Mark, and John. It's a story that follows the feeding of the 5,000, and it's the account of Jesus walking on water. Then Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side of the lake, while he sent the people away. After sending the people away, he went up a hill by himself to pray. When evening came, Jesus was there alone, and by this time the boat was far out in the lake, tossed about by the waves because the wind was blowing against it. Between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came to the disciples walking on the water. When they saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and screamed with fear. Jesus spoke to them at once. "Courage," he said, "it is I. Do not be afraid." Then Peter spoke up. "Lord, if it really is you, order me to come out on the water to you." "Come," answered Jesus. So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water to Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he was afraid and started to sink down in the water. "Save me, Lord," he cried. At once Jesus reached out and grabbed hold of him and said, "How little faith you have. Why did you doubt?" They both got into the boat, and the wind died down. Then the disciples in the boat worshipped Jesus. "Truly, you are the Son of God," they exclaimed. Now, this particular story follows, as I mentioned, the feeding of the 5,000, and both of these two accounts, told, as I say, in Matthew, Mark, and John, have a similar pattern. We hear at the beginning how Jesus takes himself off to a lonely place. Jesus goes off to be alone. For the feeding of the 5,000, this is immediately because of him hearing the news of the death of John the Baptist. In this other case, when Jesus is walking on the water, he takes himself off to be alone after the healing of so many people and the feeding of the 5,000. So there's a starting off of Jesus on his own. Then there's a situation in which logic and normal reasoning would seem to be inadequate. Lots of people are here and they need feeding, and Jesus says to the disciples, well, give them something to eat. And when it comes to walking on the water, of course, it seems completely incredible that that should be possible. Jesus says to the disciples in the first account of the feeding of the 5,000, "Gather what you can, so bring what you have to me," and that is then transformed into a meal which is sufficient to feed a miraculous number of people. And not only a miraculous number of people, but with plenty to spare. And with it being good food too. What was simple and straightforward was turned into what was rich and nourishing. When you bring things to God, God can do wonderful things with them. And so it's the same kind of story when Jesus walks on the water, because the walking on the water itself is one thing. It is a sign of the miraculous nature of God in human form in Jesus. But it's also about the human interaction and the response to God's presence. For the disciples are all at sea, excuse the pun, and they are frightened. They see Jesus, but it can't be Jesus, so they scream with fear. "Courage," he says, "don't be afraid, it's I." And then, just as a small boy brings loaves and fishes to Jesus, and 5,000 men and women plus are fed, so Jesus says to Peter in response to his impetuous cry, "Come, take a risk, step out of the boat." And there are many study courses that follow that principle of, if you're going to take a risk for God, you need to take that first step and do something amazing and step out of the boat. Move from security and what is known and what is understood and trusted to place yourself in God's hands. And Peter does this, of course. And miraculously, Peter is walking on water. a wonderful, wonderful, contrary to nature thing happens. Peter is walking on water. But then, as we can all understand, after the first few seconds of, oh my goodness, this is amazing, he then looks around and thinks, my goodness, this is completely scary. And as someone who lived his life on the lake and with water and knows the dangers of water, so the realization creeps in, and the submission and the surrender to God become compromised by very real experiences that tell you this is not right. This is not where I'm meant to be. And so he starts to sink. But what does he do? He cries out, "Save me, Lord." So there is trust, and there is absolute assurance. Or maybe there's just pure terror. But either way, there's a wonderful moment then. At once, Jesus reached out and grabbed hold of him and rescues him and put him back in the boat. Now, if this was John's gospel, he'd be focusing on ignoring all of that and just moving to the real miracle here, which is that when they both got back into the boat and the wind died down, the disciples worshipped Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God," because the total miracle here is the revelation of who Jesus was. We're not told what the reaction of the crowd were. I'm sure so many of them were so physically distant from Jesus that it was simply a case of, oh, great, food's arrived. And then they went away. Of course, people saw the healing miracles and people went away praising Jesus and were completely convinced that this was an extraordinary man. But the revelation that Jesus was God in human form, as John so clearly explores, is a gift that is given by God. The scales fall away from the eyes. And it is often, of course, in moments of complete terror and complete sense of where our own strength and security has failed us, where all logic has faded away, and where we are left simply with experience, living that childlike life of simply responding to what is before us, being confronted with what is really there and not having that sort of veneer, that lens that sort of taints everything and says, oh, right, okay, so I understand this. I know what I'm thinking here because this has happened to me before. Encounters with God are nothing like we've had before. They're nothing like the logical world that we rely on day by day to tell us the simple things of life, when we need to go shopping, when we need to put petrol in the car, those things. These are simply process. But to encounter God is something completely and utterly different. So they worshipped Jesus. "Truly, you are the Son of God," they exclaimed. And that is the highlight of these two stories, that the disciples had a deeper and more accurate insight into who Jesus actually was because of the things they saw him do. Prior to this, we have the story told in Matthew's Gospel of Jesus being rejected at Nazareth. And he says a prophet is respected everywhere except in his hometown and by his own family. Familiarity is a very good reason to not abandon oneself. But of course, the point of all of this is, like Peter, we all need to find our way of taking risks for God. If God has come into your heart and has moved you with a sense of a transcendent love, a universal acceptance, grace, forgiveness, and kindness to all people, whoever they are and wherever they are, then there is a need to do something with that response. There is a need to do something and respond. Because to be given something so amazing, in the words of the song, demands my soul, my life, my all. It doesn't matter what that is, but we all need to be in situations where we're in a boat and where we are able to step out and to take that risk for God. That could mean taking physical and practical risks, though with one's personal safety, but that's not really the point. The point is to serve others in love, and that is a risky venture. And it is to put oneself in a situation where you risk being misunderstood, at the very least. Certainly in situations where you feel out of your comfort zone. Certainly in situations when you're made to see with a new clarity that what you're doing is service for service's sake, not for your own praise, not for your own satisfaction, but to serve because people are loved by God just as much as everybody is. And there is a need to do the same. That's what Jesus commanded the disciples at the Last Supper, wasn't it? One final commandment, that you love one another. This has to be the ultimate and only and most significant attribute of any community that calls itself Christian, that it demonstrates by its actions that all are loved by God and that everybody is accepted. But it is only in those moments when you take risks for God, when you can say in your worry and in your disquiet and in your discomfort, "Save me, Lord," that you will know truly God's hand reaching out to you and bringing you back to safety and into the presence of love beyond words. If you don't take any steps out of the boat, you never get to walk on water. And we have something to look at which can inspire total, profound, and infinite confidence. And that is the glorious face of God and the total assurance of love that God gives.